Welcome back to my movie review series. Today's episode will be the 2022 Disney Plus original movie, and this one is The Ice Age Adventures of Buck Wild. The movie was released on Disney Plus on January 28, 2022. The movie is streaming on Disney Plus. Sometime after the events of Collision Course, Crash and Eddie accidentally cause an avalanche and destroy the gang's summer habitat in an attempt to practice one of their stunts. Manny, Sid, Diego, and Ellie get mad at them, declaring they would not survive on their own. Wanting to prove them wrong, Crash and Eddie secretly leave their temporary camp while the others are asleep. Finding them gone the next morning, Ellie insists that they go search for them. Meanwhile, Crash and Eddie stumble upon the entrance to the Lost World, a land full of dinosaurs, and run into their old friend Buck, who saves them from raptors and tells them that a Protoceratops named Orson, who was bullied when he was young for having a massive brain, has escaped from exile and has come to conquer the Lost World. Buck tries to get Crash and Eddie back to their home, but finds out that Orson has covered the entrance with a boulder. Buck and the possums go to Buck's shelter, where Buck explains how he used to be part of an old team that established a watering hole as a place for animals to peacefully coexist. He goes on to say that Orson did not accept an offer to join his team because he believed in a world where the strong dominate the weak, with him being the leader. Buck further explains that they defeated Orson and banished him to an island, where he learned that he can control two raptors with fire. The two raptors find Buck's hideout, but Z, Azarilla, who used to be part of Buck's former team, saves Buck and the possums by using a gas to knock out the raptors. Orson then gets an army of raptors and attacks the watering hole, with Buck and Z telling the animals to evacuate. Buck and Z, their relationship strained after their teams break up, go with the possums to get help. They arrive at the Lost Lagoon and summon their old friend Mama, a Tyrannosaurus. When Orson and his raptors arrive and attack them again, Buck and Z forgive each other for breaking up the old team and agree to work together, and plan to take down Orson once and for all. The story thankfully isn't as idiotically ridiculous as it was in Collision Course and to an extent Continental Drift, but instead it's painfully dull, boring, and unengaging. The action's not that interesting, the comedy is painfully unfunny aside from a few decent jokes, and there's no sense of genuine heart or charm to it. And on top of that, despite Buck Wild being the title character, the movie's true focus is on Crash and Eddie as they set out to prove to the herd that they can live on their own, which is a pretty dumb move considering that Crash and Eddie are two of the worst characters in the whole franchise. But I will give it credit that it does give a bit of an interesting insight on Buck's past. It does have a neat series recap in the opening scene which actually mentions Roshan and the humans from the first movie, which is something none of the other sequels did. And I will give it a bit of credit that it's a more simple and basic story that's not trying to outdo itself. The humor really falls flat in this movie, as most of the movie's comedy relies on the usual shtick from Crash and Eddie, which means a bunch of cringy puns and pop culture references, and them acting like complete idiots. However, there are at least a couple of decent jokes that do manage to get a little laugh. The heart of the movie is really lacking as whenever it tries to have a tender and sentimental moment, it doesn't feel all that genuine and instead comes off as more manipulative. The action scenes like the avalanche in the beginning, the raptors and spider chasing Crash and Eddie, Buck, Crash and Eddie escaping from the hideout, Orson's attack on the watering hole, and the final battle with the herd going up against Orson and his army would have been one of the movie's few interesting things, if it weren't for the animation looking super cheap and uninspired. The animation is a definite downgrade, as even though I know that this isn't a theatrical movie, and that blue sky wasn't involved with it, it still looks very unimpressive. I will give it credit that the backgrounds are at least nicely done, and the characters all still have some good designs, but the character animation and effects are what really sink it, as the movements just look awkward, and the effects are lackluster such as the textures and lighting. The characters Crash and Eddie, the real protagonists of the movie, are still just as annoying as ever, and are possibly at their worst here. And even though they want to try and prove that they can survive on their own and mature, they still make tons of idiotic decisions. Buck is at least decently likable, and it thankfully closer to his portrayal in Dawn of the Dinosaurs than how he was portrayed in Collision Course, as while he is a bit kooky, he's still pretty well-meaning and does help the other characters quite a bit. And again, he does have a somewhat interesting backstory. Z isn't really that interesting a character, as she's basically just in this to serve as a love interest for Bach, just as Shara was in Continental Drift, or Brooke from Collision Course, but on the upside, she is at least a somewhat more interesting character than them. The usual main characters from the prior films like Manny, Ellie, Sid, and Diego have been regulated to being more minor characters here, and are pretty forgettable in this. Also, what happened to Shira? I know Peaches isn't in it because at the end of Collision Course she and Julian moved to another area, and Granny stayed behind at the Fountain of Youth and became younger, which explains their absence. But Shira isn't once mentioned in this movie. And on top of that, this movie has no trace of Scrat whatsoever. Orson is a pretty lame villain, as his whole shtick of wanting to build a survival of the fittest world where only the strong survive is very stock and generic. And on top of that, he's just not that interesting of a character. The voice acting is a mixed bag, as even though there are some decent performances like Simon Pegg as Bach and Justina Machado as Z, and there are a couple of decent sound-alikes with Dominique Jennings as Ellie and Skylar Stone as Diego, but everyone else sound either really off, like Sean Ken and Elias Reyes just doing a weak Ray Romano impression for Manny. Jake Green sounds very off as Sid. Vincent Tong and Aaron Harris sound somehow even more aggravating as Crash and Eddie, and Utkarsh Ambudkar sounds pretty lame and generic as Orson. The music by Bata Center does at least sound decent, but at the same time, it does sound pretty typical and generic for an adventure movie. So, what do I rate this movie? I'll probably give a 5 out of 10. That movie is not even as bad as Ice Age, Collision Course, but that one was a failure. And Ice Age has been fallen apart and Disney has been running out of ideas, even after Blue Sky Studios was shut it down.